The snow had been falling for 31 hours without pause. In the Canadian Rockies, winter does not announce itself politely. It arrives like a verdict, sudden, total, and without appeal. On the 3rd of February, at an elevation of just over 1,400 meters, along a logging road that hadn't seen a vehicle since October, the storm meteorologists had been tracking for 4 days, finally settled over the mountains with the quiet ferocity of something that has been patient for a long time. Eleanor Marsh had lived in her cabin for 43 years. She had outlasted 3 husbands, 2 logging companies, and the optimism of every friend who had, over the decades, suggested it was time to come back to town. She was 78 years old and had outlasted most things that tried to outlast her. But she had never seen snow fall like this. By morning of the 2nd day, the porch had ceased to exist as a distinct feature. It was simply a slope of white, leading to a door Eleanor could no longer push open. She tried at first light, pressing her full weight against the wood. The door gave 4 inches. The packed snow outside held it shut, like a hand pressed flat against the other side. She stood in her small kitchen, wearing 2 wool sweaters and her late husband Gerald's hunting socks, and looked at the window above the sink. Through the glass, there was nothing but white. Rex was watching her from his spot by the wood stove. He was 11 years old, elderly for a dog his size, with a broad chest and thick double coat of his Malamute ancestry, and amber-flecked eyes that suggested something wilder in his lineage, something neither Eleanor nor anyone else had ever quite identified. His muzzle had gone grey in the last 2 years. He moved with the careful deliberateness of a creature who has learned that joints betray you without warning, but his eyes were still sharp. His nose was still extraordinary, and right now, both were fixed on Eleanor, with an attention she had come to recognize over their 8 years together as something beyond ordinary watchfulness. He knew something was wrong, not in the way humans understand wrongness, not with language or calculation, in the way that a creature built for snow and cold, and the frozen wilderness of a continent understands threat, in the way that 8 years of living beside a woman had taught him the difference between her normal morning movements and the ones she made when she was afraid. Eleanor was afraid. She wouldn't have admitted it, not aloud, not even to Rex. But her hands moved differently than usual as she checked the wood stove, counted the remaining logs, and reached for the radio on the kitchen shelf. Static. The antenna was buried. She tried her phone. 1 bar, wavering. She dialed Thomas Birch, her neighbor 4 kilometers down the road, the man she called every Sunday to confirm that neither of them had died in the week prior. The call connected, held 3 seconds, and dropped. She tried again. Nothing. Eleanor set the phone down and stood very still, listening to the silence that 1.5 meters of snow creates, the way it swallows sound, presses down on the world, turns the familiar into something muffled and strange. The cabin felt smaller than it ever had. Rex made a low sound. Not quite a whine. Not quite a growl. "I know," Eleanor said. She said it the way she had always spoken to him, directly, as though he understood not just the tone, but the content. After 8 years, she had come to believe, in a way she'd never have admitted to anyone capable of rolling their eyes, that he mostly did. The situation was clear. Firewood inside, perhaps 2 days' worth. The cord outside under the lean-to was buried under compacted snow and effectively inaccessible. The wood stove was keeping the cabin at around 11 degrees Celsius, cold, but not yet dangerous. The problem was time. Without access to the outdoor supply, the stove would go cold. At 40 degrees Celsius, and dropping, an unheated cabin at this altitude would become fatal within hours for a woman of 78 with a replaced hip and the circulatory system of someone who had lived a hard life in a cold place. She spent the first hour at the front door, then the bedroom window, which opened 4 inches onto a solid wall of snow. She packed the gap with towels. She found gaps in the log walls and stuffed them with wool socks. Rex followed her from room to room, pressing against her leg when she stopped. His warmth was solid and real through the fabric of her trousers. "We're going to be fine," she told him. She believed it, mostly. By the afternoon of the 2nd day, she no longer believed it entirely. The indoor supply was more than half gone. The outside temperature had dropped another 6 degrees. The dizziness she'd been managing was worse now. A heaviness behind her eyes and in her hands, that she recognized as the body beginning to make decisions without consulting her. She sat at the kitchen table and thought about Thomas Birch, who would not expect to hear from her until the day after tomorrow. She got up and gave Rex his full evening portion, even though it was only 3 in the afternoon. "You're a good dog," she told him. "The best dog." He thumped his tail twice against the floor. Rex smelled it before Eleanor knew anything had changed. He had been lying beside her on the bed, both of them beneath every blanket she owned, Eleanor in a half-sleep that had become indistinguishable from exhaustion, when his head lifted with a suddenness that had not been in his movements for years. Not the slow, careful motion of an arthritic elder. Something older. Something that went back further than 11 years, further than Eleanor, further than the cabin. His nostrils worked in the silence. The cold air carried frozen pine, deep snow, the mineral stillness of the mountain. But underneath, from a direction he triangulated with the automatic precision of his ancestry, there was something that did not belong. A human smell, but not Eleanor's. Rex got up and went to the front door, and stood there and began to bark. Eleanor stirred. "Lie down," she said, her voice thick. Rex did not lie down. Outside, 400 meters away, Thomas Birch was doing something very foolish and entirely necessary. He had not been able to reach Eleanor, not on the second attempt, not on the third, and he was not a man given to dramatic conclusions, but he had lived 40 years in the Rockies and knew what a storm like this one did to a woman living alone at Eleanor's altitude and Eleanor's age. He had driven a snowmobile rather than waiting for the county crew. The snowmobile had broken through a snow-covered drainage culvert 400 meters from the cabin and was now buried to its frame. Thomas stood in snow to his thighs, alone, in air cold enough to make breathing feel like an act of minor violence. He could not see the cabin. The snow had consumed it, roofline, walls, everything. The whole structure subsumed into the general whiteness of the landscape. You would not have known a cabin existed there. That was when he heard the dog. Rex's bark was not frantic. It was not the high-pitched alarm of a frightened animal. It was something lower and steadier, a series of deep, resonant calls that carried through the muffled air with a quality Thomas could only have described, had he tried, as deliberate. As though the animal understood that the goal was not volume, but reach. Steady, insistent, coming from slightly left of where Thomas had been looking, which gave him his bearing. He began moving toward it. 400 meters through thigh-deep snow at 43 Celsius, a thin wind finding every gap in his layering. He moved with his head down, efficiently, following the bark the way a sailor follows a foghorn in the dark. Rex did not stop. He barked from inside the cabin, his voice carrying through walls and snow and the freezing air between them, with a constancy that was beyond training or habit. It was need made audible. It was the voice of an animal who had decided, with the full weight of his loyal and ancient nature, that the woman behind him was not going to die today. Eleanor heard the quality of the barking change before she heard anything else. Rex had different voices for different things. This one, lower, with a particular vibration she had learned over 8 years, was the voice he used when something was real. She got herself upright. The dizziness came back harder. Her hands were clumsy. Her feet were colder than they should have been inside Gerald's wool socks. She was moving toward the kitchen when she heard it. A voice, outside, muffled by snow, but unmistakable. "Eleanor! Eleanor Marsh, can you hear me?" She pressed her hand flat against the front door and leaned her forehead against the cold wood and simply breathed. Rex pressed his flank against her leg. For a moment she let herself feel what it felt like to be found. "Tom!" Her voice came out stronger than she expected. "I'm here. I can't get the door open." "I know. Close now. Directly outside. I'm going to dig. Stay by the stove." Thomas Birch dug for 45 minutes with the folding emergency shovel he kept on the snowmobile, because 40 years in the Rockies had given him opinions about preparation. He worked with the focused economy of a man who knows technique outlasts brute force, taking the snow in sections, each one costing him heat and breath and the feeling in his fingers, which he kept moving deliberately. Rex's barking settled to a low murmur once Thomas was close, as though the dog, satisfied he'd been heard, had downgraded from emergency broadcast to quiet confirmation. When the door finally came open, and the cold flooded in, and Eleanor stood there in Gerald's hunting socks and 2 wool sweaters. Thomas looked at her without speaking for a moment. "You look terrible," he said. "You're 400 meters from your snowmobile," she said. "Don't lecture me." He got the stove burning higher, fire starter from the emergency kit, and made her eat while he worked the satellite communicator. The kind Eleanor had refused to own for 15 years on the grounds that it was an admission of vulnerability. She said nothing about this now. When you have been found by a friend in a buried cabin because your dog refused to stop barking, certain positions become temporarily flexible. The emergency services arrived 3 hours later. A snowcat, 2 paramedics, a search and rescue volunteer who moved through the snow with the cheerful energy of someone who had not yet learned to be afraid of it. They noted Eleanor's core temperature was lower than they would have liked, and her left toes showed mild frostbite, and told her, in the careful language of people trained to be reassuring, that she had been very lucky. She knew she had been lucky. She looked at Rex sitting beside her on the cabin floor, watching the paramedics with the dignified curiosity of a dog who has decided these new humans are probably acceptable. His gray muzzle, his amber eyes, his absolute, uncomplicated presence. Luck, she thought, or something that looked like it from the outside. She was permitted to take Rex to the hospital. This was non-negotiable, the one point on which Eleanor Marsh would not flex. Not for 2 paramedics, not for Thomas Birch, not for anyone. He rode on the floor of the snowcat between her feet, warm and solid, and entirely unimpressed by the mechanical noise around him. The hospital kept her 2 days. She endured it with the patience of a woman who has learned which battles are worth having, and she slept each night with Rex curled on the floor beside her, which the nursing staff allowed with a minimum of discussion. On the 3rd day, Thomas drove her home. The county crews had cleared the door, repaired the antenna, made the firewood accessible. Thomas had arranged all of it from a distance, called in 40 years of accumulated favors without being asked, because that was the kind of man he was. Eleanor stood on her cleared porch in the February cold and looked at the landscape. Deep white in every direction, the dark line of pine at the ridge, the sky the particular pale blue that follows a great storm. She had known this view for 43 years and had no intention of knowing it from anywhere else. Rex stood at her hip, watching the same view. She put her hand on his head, the soft, thick fur, the warmth beneath, the slow, steady breathing of an old dog in the cold air. He didn't look up. He leaned into her hand, slightly, the way he always had. "Good dog," she said, the same words she had said 1,000 times. But standing here, in the quiet after a storm that had tried to take her from the world and been refused, anchored, at the foundation, in the decision of an 11-year-old dog with a gray muzzle who had stood at a door and barked into the snow until someone came, the words held more than they ever had before. Rex thumped his tail once against the porch boards. She understood. That spring, a satellite communicator appeared on Eleanor's kitchen shelf, next to the radio. She called Thomas more often. She called her granddaughter in Calgary more often. Small revisions, made quietly, in the way of a woman who does not announce the things she has changed her mind about. Rex was allowed on the bed now. He had slept on the floor for 8 years because Eleanor had held firm opinions about dogs on beds. She released those opinions without ceremony. Some things, it turns out, you only understand the value of once you have nearly lost them. He slept, curled against her back, through the winter nights that followed. His warmth familiar, his breathing the last sound she heard before sleep. The mountain winters kept coming, as they always had, deep and cold and indifferent to the small lives sheltering within them. But in the cabin on the logging road, a woman and her dog moved through them together, the dog watching from his place by the stove, the woman checking the firewood with a thoroughness she had previously considered unnecessary. Both of them, in their different ways, aware of what it had cost. Both of them, in their different ways, grateful to still be here to pay it.